Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and as a new party is announced on the left wing, mirroring the new one on the right, which emerged a few years ago with Reform UK, now seems a good opportunity to explain how broken our voting system is in Britain in a way which doesn't need graphs or statistics. So, as my usual explainers do, this is an explanation for the weakness of our voting system, which should work for anyone who's ever handled a shopping basket. But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So for the Westminster elections, we have used a first past the post system for centuries in the UK. There are problems with the system from a fairness point of view, but it did at least work most of the time, although not all, for setting up stable governments for centuries. But this is because voters have essentially had a choice of two candidates. First past the post only works when you are choosing between two credible options. First, it was the Whigs and the Tories. Then the Tories split a little and merged into, well, different Tories, but they call themselves Conservatives. Then it was the Conservatives and the Whigs, then the Conservatives and the Liberals. Then the Liberals fell away as Labour grew during the first half of the last century. Then it was the Conservatives and Labour as it grew to pretty much now. But over the last few decades, other parties have grown to the point where a party outside of the big two is able to gain significant shares of the vote. At the last election, we had the most fragmented vote in history, and the next one looks like being even worse. But how to explain how it's the voting system which is at fault when people think the system works so well for so many centuries? Well, I'd normally pull out graphs at this point, but as not everyone is into their maths, let's use something everyone can easily understand: a marketplace. We're all used to the concept of a marketplace. These days, that market's probably online for most of us. But whether online, high street, retail outlet, or a more traditional marketplace, they're all the same in concept. It's a place where you can find traders. We go there and we try to find things we want, and we get the best that we can for our money. We're all used to this concept. So in a market, if there were suddenly more stalls and traders, you'd get more choice. Now, more choice means you are more likely to come away with something you really like. Conversely, if loads of those traders leave the marketplace, then you have less choice. And that less choice means you are more likely to have to make do with the best you can get. So we're all familiar with the idea that if you have more choice, you are more likely to get a result that you like. More choice doesn't guarantee getting exactly what you want, and less choice doesn't mean you can't get what you want. But the more choice you have, the more likely you are to be happy with your purchase. And choice works much the same anywhere. You go to a college or a university with lots of courses, that's more choice. That greater choice means you're more likely to be able to enroll in a course you really want to study. More outlets at the food mall, you're more likely to get a meal you really like. More screens at the cinema, you're more likely to find a film you really want to watch. The more children you have, the more chance you have one that will grow up to not like bad music. In whatever context, choice doesn't guarantee you'll get what you want, but you are more likely to get what you want. So if choice always gives you a better chance of getting what you want, then the same should apply with political parties in elections, shouldn't it? But it doesn't with the system we have in the UK, because our voting system is now incompatible with party political systems. The opposite is actually true. It used to be that smaller parties couldn't get anywhere because in a first past the post system, they would just be swallowed up. So pragmatic voters, activists and politicians would band together into a larger political group, which could command enough votes to win. This is why we talk about a broad church in political parties, bringing different groups together who've got a common cause vaguely in agreement in order to win power. But with the way our voting system works, more choice doesn't now increase your chance of getting what you want. It actually does the opposite. More choice means you are more likely to get something you really don't want at all. Let's take Reform UK as our first example. At the last election, voters had two right-wing parties to choose from. But this choice for right-wing voters made a left-wing government more likely because their own vote was split. Now we have a new party on the left emerging, where the vote has already been split between Labour and the Greens, with, some going to the SNP in Scotland and Plaid in Wales, and a few Liberal left-wing votes going with the Liberal Democrats as well. One of the reasons for the success of the Conservatives for so long is that the right-wing vote mostly defaulted to them, until recently, But the left-wing vote had more choice, which actually just split it, making right-wing governments more likely, which is why we mostly got right-wing governments. The same is true of the new Mystery Box Party with Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. A new party on the left gives more choice to left-wing voters. But exercising that choice means we are more likely to see a right-wing government. So you will vote for a stronger NHS. What you will get is a privatised NHS. Choice in our political system is doing the opposite of choice in any other context. So is there something about politics which makes choice unworkable? No, it's the voting system which is at fault, not the extra choice. There are two main types of modern system of voting which would alleviate the problems: proportional representation and preferential voting. Rather than get bogged down, let's think of a single election of a single politician, perhaps a mayor. So we'll talk about a mayoral election where the system is reverting back to preferential voting anyway. So let's compare the two systems. So imagine, just to keep it simple, we have four candidates. We have a right-wing candidate, we have a centrist candidate, we have a centre-left candidate and a further left candidate. Let's also say that voters in this area are 50% left-wing, 20% centrist and 30% right-wing. So the population is much more left-wing than right-wing. In a first-past-the-post system, most of the right-wing votes will back the right-wing candidate, but the left-wing votes will divide themselves between the two left-wing candidates. Now, if one of the left-wing candidates is much more convincing than the other, then they can still win. But if the votes split more evenly, you end up with an area which is 50% left-wing, but only 30% right-wing, getting a right-wing mayor. More choice got you the worst option. This arrangement favours the right-wing candidate because their vote isn't split. The reverse would, of course, be true if there was only one left-wing candidate but two right-wing candidates in a mostly right-wing area. But in this case, the right-wing candidate wins. So whether a right-wing or left-wing candidate is chosen has less to do with what the people want and more to do with which side splits the vote more. More choice leads you to being more likely to get the opposite of what you want. Now, let's look at a preferential voting system. In this system, you rank candidates first, second and third. If no single candidate wins a majority of the votes in the first round, the candidate in last place is eliminated and their votes are redistributed according to like second preference votes. This process of redistributing votes according to a priority of your vote continues until one candidate wins a majority. In this system, the left wing is not disadvantaged by having multiple candidates. Sure, there can still be such a thing as too many, even with this system, but having a few different ones gives you the benefits of choice without the downsides of that choice leading to what you would think is the worst option. Because each left-wing voter in this scenario would vote for their preferred candidate first, their less preferred left-wing candidate second, you would think, and probably the centrist candidate third. This is what will happen with our future mayoral contests once the new law is in place. Voters will say, well, this is what I want. This is what is all right. And this all right is better than the worst option, right? Just like how it used to be. But because we use first past the post for Westminster elections, choice is actually poisonous to us. We are already getting people elected on 25% of the vote. That means it's possible to be elected even if you are considered the worst option by 75% of voters. Choice risks the worst option. This is the danger we have in Britain. Nigel Farage is the least preferred of all political leaders amongst the population, but he can still become Prime Minister because the majority divide their votes against him. First past the post worked when it had two main parties. It still wasn't a fair system, but it did at least function most of the time. But now that we have more and more viable parties emerging, taking advantage of the increased fragmentation of the vote, the system no longer works. In fact, the system is now so badly broken, there's a very high chance that voters get the result they least want. This is like a vegan going into that marketplace, seeing lots of new vegan stalls open, brilliant, and coming away with a sirloin steak. That would be a mad scenario. How could that happen? Yet this is what our voting system is. And it is a problem of the voting system, which could be fixed by changing the voting system. Proportional representation as a framework with preferential voting for top-up members would allow election where people can enjoy the choice without ending up with their least preferred choice. And it is incredible to me that there are some people who complain about the level of mistrust in politics and yet support a system which means that when you have more choice, you are less likely to get anything you even accept. If a vegan goes into a marketplace with lots of vegan stalls and comes away with a pound of pork sausages, you can bet they're going to be confused and upset about that marketplace. So of course voters feel the same way about our politics. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and for more content you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.